Prime Minister during King Idris, he appealed from Dubai and he made very good statement, So what Al Jazeera work more than Twitter or the social media, I think, tools, give the Libyan voice, one voice, and it helped them really to communicate through Al Jazeera. So there were no disconnection between Tripoli, Sabha, Benghazi, Gdamis, Wadan.
A very comprehensive and good answer. Just to support that, the internet was important, but there was all forms of other media. I actually wrote an article about the media created by the uprisings. As soon as areas were freed in Benghazi, people were making radio stations. As soon as a new area would be freed in Kufra, they would start up a broadsheet that they would pass around. And the ability for these things to be quickly posted on the internet, so you could see that in Kufra they were writing this and posting it on the internet. But in Ghadamis, which was still partially under Gaddafi control, they also had a kind of underground newspaper. And then, of course, Libya, Ahrar TV, and all these things that Doha gave them the ability to have other TV stations. It accomplished what Noman has just said of allowing people in one part of the country to see, oh, they're having another uprising. It's a little different. They're talking about different things, but they're also overthrowing Gaddafi. Maybe that answers that question. We can go to another one. Ambassador.
Thanks very much. Well, I hesitate to intervene because I know very little about Libya. I visited it and dealt with it when I was director for the Middle East in the Foreign Office some time ago. But I was ambassador in Iraq, as you mentioned, and I think it'd be interesting to try out a couple of parallels with what happened there, because in some ways you do have some similarities. I mean, here is a country whose society was completely atomized by the long decades of rule of Saddam Hussein, much more ruthless than perhaps Gaddafi was, even more ruthless perhaps. And yet now you have, 11 years after the change of government, still an ineffective government, unable to guarantee security, unable to guarantee public services despite vast resources. And the situation made worse by what in Iraq was the de-Baathification process, and which in Libya seems determined should be a political isolation law whereby you remove every single person who had anything to do with the previous regime. Now, in trying to address that, someone you mentioned, I think, legitimacy is absolutely crucial. I mean, people will not, particularly now, for the reasons Richard outlined, will not just quietly accept authoritarian rule if it's not legitimate. And to overcome that, to try and create that, you need real leadership. So I think my real question is, where is the leadership going to come from in Libya? I mean, we heard a sort of optimistic idea that the key bit of leadership had to do with security. Regrouping in the state the legitimacy of monopoly of violence is going to be achieved somehow by the end of the year. That would be certainly a great step. But where else will the legitimacy to stand up effective government and start delivering public services? Where's that going to come from? Is it going to come from Ali Zaidan, on whom the West is putting all their hopes and faith at the moment? If it's going to come from Islamists, will the Islamists of Libya do a better job than Morsi in Egypt is doing, to completely failing to unite the country around and continue to give the message, just as Maliki has in Iraq, that actually he's playing a game which is only to the benefit of one part of society? And my other question, that's my main question, my other question is, could you say something about the economic institutions now? Because again, this is going to be crucial to getting the economy, if we're going to diversify the economy, finding away from oil, it's going to have private sector institutions. These, I think, were very much discouraged by Gaddafi. Are there some signs of those being stood up?
Well, great question. I'll take the first bite of this apple and then turn it over to Richard. In one word, where could the legitimacy come from? The answer is the Constitution. That's the big thing happening in Libya right now, is the Constitution process, and I'll talk about that briefly. But to go to your parallels with Iraq and the issue of de-Baathification, it's one that I feel very strongly about. I've written quite a few op-eds counseling that Libya should not have its own de-Baathification process, something I wrote about in 2011, and sadly, Libya has creeped closer and closer to its own de-Baathification process. Now, as you know, but everyone in the audience may not, by having a de-Baathification process, it meant that it didn't matter if you were a water minister or your expertise was in sewage. If you were a member of the Ba'ath Party, it was essentially, and if particularly if you were a Sunni member of the Ba'ath Party in Iraq, it was essentially impossible to get a high-level political job as a result of that process. In Libya, there was no one-party state. Gaddafi claimed that there were no political parties, so there is no Ba'ath party that could just be, you know, pushed out. Do you have a party member's card? So the way that the Libyans have framed this debate is if you serve the Gaddafi regime. Now, sadly, the problem is that, like all these authoritarian resource states, 80% of the jobs have always been in the public sector. So anyone who has any experience has, quote-unquote, served the Gaddafi regime. And in fact, all of the rebel political leaders who have any degree of experience, where did they acquire it from? Serving as reformists in the Gaddafi regime, whether it was Mahmoud Jibril or now Ali Zidane and Maghayref. So I like to go back to this French Revolution parallel here, that in the French Revolution was, of course, mostly the upper middle class who comprised the Third Estate, who wanted to push out the uber upper class of the First and Second Estates, right? But their revolution got, if not hijacked, pushed forward by the bringing in of popular groups, right? And then those groups pushed towards a more revolutionary or Jacobin-style agenda. This is a part of the teleology of all revolutions. This is what's happened in Libya. The revolution is started by these secular, mostly elite in orientation, Cyrenaican types who do have access to Facebook and Twitter, and a lot of them speak quite good English. And then those are the political class of the NTC. Unsurprisingly, when Mahmoud Jibril, who had been a reformist and ran the Economic Development Board in the latter years of the Gaddafi regime, comes up as the most important figurehead and prime minister, that develops some resentment. Wait a second, this guy was just 3 weeks ago for Gaddafi. However, the new social groups who have been brought into the process by forming their own militias and doing this, that, and the other, have gone too far, you know? Like in that French revolutionary scenario. They say, okay, well, off with their heads of anyone who's had any kind of public sector job. And now, there's even a reason to say that, a very cynical one. Because if you're an Islamist, or you were in the Brotherhood, or you're some poor unemployed guy, your chance to move up the ranks is a lot better if you make sure that anyone who had the education or the background or training to have had those jobs is now deemed ineligible. So that structural de-Ba'athification of the political isolation law is something which is very sinister. I believe that the strikes and seizures of the ministries in Tripoli at the end of April and May of this year are because guys behind the scenes know if we kick out everyone with experience, we're going to benefit. So I could talk more about other aspects, but yes, de-Ba'athification, very bad in Iraq. Anything similar to it is bad in Libya. The only hope is that the political isolation law will be implemented not to the letter of the law, and that some people with experience will be allowed to hold their ministries. And it's a very positive sign that Ali Zidane, despite his connections to the old regime, is being allowed to continue as prime minister. And there's a hope that the political isolation law is not going to kick out anyone with any degree of experience. But to toss over to Richard, this is something you know quite a lot about.
Well, I think it's a very difficult question to answer, I have to be honest. I don't think there is a clear answer yet. I feel that there's not a complete parallel with Iraq because the lesson of the last couple of years is that the Libyans will muddle through. They won't apply the political isolation law in a very methodical way, taking it down to the letter of the law, and even the letter itself is quite unclear. We've seen it in the commercial arena as well, with several attempts to reform the laws on foreign investment and commercial participation, which have gone round in circles to the point where nobody quite knows now what the legal framework is for foreign companies working in Libya. That all remains to be clarified. But if you ask people, they'll say, we'll wait till we have a full parliament and a new government, and they'll make new laws, and all the things that have been made now, including political isolation law, will have lapsed or won't exist anymore. Nobody seems to be looking very much beyond the short term or short to medium term. In terms of leadership, yes, you're right that there don't seem to be any political leaders around, but in the past, since 2011, people who are strong personalities with a strong view of how they wanted things to go, like Mahmoud Jibril is a big example, aroused huge resentment, not just on ideological grounds or because of the connections with Saif al-Gaddafi, but because he has a vision that he wants to implement that most Libyans don't, and they're rather frightened of that. So there seems to be a bit of resistance to leadership, which means things will take longer and won't be very clear. But when you talk to Libyans, there seems a lot of faith, it may be wishful thinking, that muddling through will have a happy outcome. I very much agree with Jason that the constitutional debate is crucial. That's the forum, that's the arena where people's real intentions and their ultimate objectives will become clear. I think lots of people have done lots of thinking and drafting about constitutions behind the scenes that will all come onto the table, and then there will be a real political debate, and that will determine the future.
So that's another two years, according to Michael Aaron, the current ambassador.
Yes. It plays out over those 2 years.
Yeah. It will take until 2015 before you have a legitimate government elected based on the elections described by the new constitution.
That's a year and a half behind the timetable, as it was initially laid out. But if we were talking to specialists, we could get more details into that. Maybe we should collate some questions now and take two at a time. But Magnus and then James.
Yeah, sure. My question's on Islamists, and might be asked Mr. Benotman to answer it. And I work on Africa south of the Sahara, so it kind of applies to that. To what extent is there sympathy, perhaps not from all the Islamists who are seeking kind of a political power in Libya, for more kind of dangerous groups who exist, the remnant from the Algerian civil war who are now making a lot of trouble in Mali, and perhaps using the south of Libya as bases and doing other things in places like Niger and other parts of the Sahel?
Yeah, I suppose my question is to do with the relations between Britain and Libya. And obviously between 2003 and 2011, you've got a lot of compromises being made by the British government, torture of dissidents, Muslims being handed back to Libya. In the UK press, that was seen as quite embarrassing, but presumably in Libya, that must have generated real anger. And has that caused any problems for the British government since then?
Well, let's start with Magnus' question.
The Islamists, yeah? It's there's old relation between Libyans and Algerians specifically, but it wasn't happy end, mid-90s, because what's used to known as GIA, they've killed 15 members of the LIG in Algeria, and they were there supposed to help them in terms of training. They went from Afghanistan in 1994. And because of ideological conflict, they killed them, all of them. Since then, I think until today, there's still a lot of suspicious between the mainstream Libyans, including the jihadists, and the Algerians. And I believe even within Al-Qaeda, according to my knowledge. But unfortunately, in December 2011, Mukhtar al-Mukhtar, the one-eyed guy, he entered Libya. He's well known, yeah. And he spent about 4 months in Libya, and he went to many cities, including up north, near the coast, including Sirte, I believe. Okay, and he established very good network there. I'm not saying here Al-Qaeda members, but I think networking may be more important than members, recruiting members, because you will have access to office space, if I might call it, And according to my knowledge, again, I believe at one stage he received a few millions cash coming from a third party, but through Libyans, delivered directly to him. Third party, I mean outside the region. So I think this story itself, it might tell you exactly, where we're going to end up. Before that, before the revolution, 2010, January, there were about 50 Libyans only fighting with Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. Maximum. 50 Libyans only before the Now, after when they established, for at least 1 year, they're on whatever they call it, in northern Mali, the Islamic State there with other Islamist groups. Many Libyans, they ended up there. Some of them just for a visit, to visit them, to explore the situation. A lot of the commanders, including Africans and Mauritanians, they were using the Libyan semi-cards in their mobile phones in Mali, okay? So there were a lot of communications, okay, and networking and people there. And including now, there's, I don't know why they call it Salvador Pass, between Niger and Libya, they are there. Most of the people, they've been displaced from northern Mali because of self-help operation. They ended up there. And according to my knowledge, I think for them just going back and forth to Libya, southern Nigeria, and Niger, it's as if someone going from Cambridge to London. No problem at all for them. And it's still very difficult to control there. So the network is there. It's very dangerous. And I will end up with saying something. There is rumors, but intelligence rumors, which is more than, it's not social rumors. The 6 French citizens kidnapped a few years ago. There's strong rumors they are somewhere in southern Libya, because of like some people they provided safe haven to Mukhtar network in Libya to hide there, especially in particular regarding the 6 French hostages.
Okay, we'll go on to the British Libya question.
Okay, so I'll split your question into 2 parts in terms of the British relationship with Libya between 2003 and 2011. The first part on the political side was the rapprochement with the regime and the opening commercially to British companies. There, I think that was well-intentioned, and I personally think it was the right thing to do at the time. I think the government felt with some justification, you deal with the regimes you've got, we're not in a position to choose who we deal with. And the best way to influence the Libyan regime was to work with them and try and encourage and improve their international behaviour, and bring them back to reward them give them incentives for behaving respectfully and properly, including in terms of human rights internally. I admit we didn't achieve a great deal, as much as we could have done, or as much as we would have liked to have done. Internally, but there was certainly no lack of, in my short time in Libya, no lack of difficult discussions about human rights and the behaviour of the Libyan government internally. On the security side and what it meant for that cooperation meant for Libyan nationals who then suffered because they were regarded as potential or with a track record of terrorism or subversion. I have to confess that I'm not well versed in the detail on that, so I don't know much about the individual cases, but within Libya certainly it would have caused bad feeling with their families and their immediate associates. Many of them were in the east. In Tripoli, I didn't come across that even from human rights groups in Tripoli. But it's something that would have been kept within the circles of the particular people involved, but Noman may know more about
Yeah, it's very important to add something here. I think it's, I agree with you completely. I think it was very important when UK tried to help, to rehabilitate, the Libyan regime. And I think a lot of Libyans, they benefit from that in terms of the openness of the regime. I can even, tell you something like first-hand information. It's Colonel Gaddafi, he wasn't happy with that relation.